Hello, everyone, and welcome to this week's episode of CU Faith Fridays. This week, we have joining us a staff member, Abdul Staten, who works at Caldwell University. So, we're going to hear a little bit more today about what he does, the work that he does, and a little bit more about him personally. So, welcome, Abdul. Thank you for joining us. And as always, to get started, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Thanks, Colleen. So the first question, a little bit about who I am. It's a lot. So like Colleen said, my name is Abdul Staten. I work here at Caldwell. It's been almost 2 years. And my official title, is Director of Student Advocacy and Prevention Awareness. Right, and so that's a lot of words. But to summarize it, my office is responsible for response, advocacy, and prevention education related to sexual and intimate partner violence as well as stalking. So that's kind of I guess, the big umbrella of what I do. So we kind of do a number of things related to providing programs and events such as Take Back the Night, the Clothesline Project. I also run a peer education program to have a peer education intern. So we're trying to get heavy in social media, right? We also do biocenter intervention training. So when the first year students come in, right, over the summer, we have conversations related to things like consent, some of the online platforms we also supervise and manage. But essentially, what we're trying to do is create a campus culture here that stands against sexual violence and stands in solidarity with survivors of sexual violence. And our tagline, or our kind of vision, if you will, is that we are looking to create a community with safe, healthy, consensual relationships flourish, right? And so in that regard, we have conversations related to masculinity, healthy relationships, media presence in terms of objectification and sexualization of women as well as men, right? And so we try to fold in folks from the LGBTQIA community, right? Trans folks. So that's kind of the again broad level perspective of what I do. But on a day-to-day basis, that looks really different, right? So some days it could be responding to a bunch of emails. Some days it could be making flyers. Some days it could be coordinating a training sessions for my peer educator. So no 2 days are different. And then now with COVID, that's even more of I guess, a wild card or kind of a variable, right? Where like we have to provide, advocacy, or rather teach people how to provide advocacy. But how do you teach advocacy and like counseling related stuff when people aren't connecting physically, right? And so a lot of ways that you connect with someone, or that you learn to listen to a survivor story and know like what to say next, goes to being in that same physical space and seeing how their eye twitches or their leg shifts, right when they speak about a certain thing, and then that gives you the prompt of saying, hey, you can talk as much about that or as little about that as you want. And right, so without that, it's kind of difficult to do that true counseling advocacy stuff. But we try best, and we're just excited to be here in the community, but also getting to know students and staff, and right, and really giving people the skills, raising awareness, increasing knowledge, giving folks the skills to be better people, right, better humans, but also respond to again sexual and intimate partner violence and stalking. So that's other stuff as well, but that's kind of, I guess, the core of kind of what I do.
Yeah, awesome. Awesome. Great. Um, how did you get into this work?
Good
Because it's not
question.
like someone doesn't like major in
Right.
this in undergrad, right? So
No,
how
not at
how did
all.
you get into this
How
work?
did
What's that
find
part
this?
of your journey?
Yeah. So I would say I got into this work, perhaps unbeknownst to me. And I say that because I grew up in a household full of and headed by strong women at my forefront, right? So my grandmother was the one who raised me, my mother, my sister, aunts, cousins, right? All strong women in my life. And then the more that I was in that structured environment, the more I just kind of heard and absorbed just kind of horrific tales of trauma and victimization, right? And sometimes it was like, harassment or sexual harassment or belittling, and right, so you might say stuff like mansplaining, but like that wasn't a term when I was growing up. It was just kind of how like what my aunts would go through, and um, in hearing and learning that so much of my life, I just kind of took on that. Um, I knew that I wanted to do something to make kind of the future generations better, right? In terms of how folks, women primarily, but not only, who had faced trauma, so that they didn't have to face it any longer, or so that if they faced it, they could, be not as many roadblocks in the way, right? So you're right. I didn't go to college or school for preventing sexual violence, because that's not a thing, right? So, but I went to school for um what did I go to school for? Film studies. I wanted to be a filmmaker. I wanted to
Okay.
like write movies and stuff like that. But I wanted
Hmm.
to write movies that had a specific social message. It wasn't just like, Armageddon, or like, The Hangover. Like I wanted to write like a specific movie. One thing led to another. I decided to go for my master's degree in counseling. And then once I got it, and I wanted to really focus in on those who are impacted by sexual trauma specifically. That's like my clinical focus.
Mm.
But when I started doing that process, I was like, I kind of would like to do more education, and not kind of be like the on the couch person. Not that it's not valid, but that wasn't my, I guess, like once I got into that environment, right? So I went into education. I started to like present, and so like you hear stories of like people like at the ground levels. Like I remember calling schools and being like, "Hi, I'm on this agency, I'm on this community, but does your school want to invite me in to come and talk to your students about like how to prevent sexual assault?" Right? And many schools are like,
Mm.
"Yeah, whatever." I never forget this one school was like, "Oh, that stuff doesn't happen here," and I was like, "Okay," and I know what to say, right? I was fresh out, and I was like, "All
Yeah.
right, it doesn't happen there. All right, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Well, you good for you, but click. I called the next school. And luckily, like a few schools said yes. I came, I did my thing, I presented, I like rehearsed it probably 1,000 times. And actually invited teachers from other schools to come watch me present. And that's kind of how I got, people to kind of trust that I was going to say good stuff. And I make sure all stuff I was talking about was like rooted in research and what have you. So yeah, I just kind of went like knocking on doors, but I was kind of emailing and calling in that respect. And I kind of just started there. So I started doing that in 2008 or something like that. And then it's kind of fast forward, kind of 10 years later, I worked here obviously at Caldwell. Before this, I was at Columbia in the city, and then prior to that, I was at Trinity College in Connecticut. And I also did some work with preventing sex trafficking, running groups with men.
Mm.
And then again, before that, I was at a nonprofit 8 years or so, doing education and training, but also running groups for survivors, but also on like we call it the sexual assault response team. So these like the volunteers who volunteer their time, obviously, right, to like
Mhm.
pick up the phone, go to the hospital, go to the police station, if someone's been victimized, right? And so the volunteers really are the core of the work, if you will. And so
Mhm.
I remember getting a call at like 12 o'clock at night saying, "Hey, so we got a survivor here. Can you come down to the hospital?" And I would get in my car and I would drive, and in the snow
Mm.
one time, and it was I got there, whatever, and sometimes they wanted nothing to do with us, right? But I was still there for like 2 or 3 hours to kind of hang out at the hospital, and
Yeah.
sometimes they did, and that's kind of how we rolled.
Yeah.
But yeah,
Wow. Wow.
I know.
That's yeah, that's really great, and I can imagine that it takes probably why there isn't a major in this. I think people really
Right.
have to find that
Yeah.
passion or that history that they
Yeah.
have with it to getting into that prevention education stuff.
Yeah.
So
But there
since
was
you've
one
been
part.
oh go
I'm
ahead.
sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. So
No, go ahead.
there was one part that I absentmindedly forgot, or probably two parts, probably like five parts, but I'll share just one of them. So my junior year in college, right, I was an RA, right, and this was before Title IX was a thing, right? It was, and I say that because we didn't have a duty to report, right? It was just you're an RA, right? Make sure you plan programs and that sort of stuff, right?
Mm.
More than that, but that's kind of the gist. But my junior year, one of my good friends, who I'm still friends with today, she had told me about a time that she was victimized, right? And it was from some guy that I knew, and some guy that was my resident, right? So
Mm.
like I knew this dude, right? And I thought it was a cool cat and all this other stuff. And so once she told me the story, I won't share it here, right? Because her own thing. But once she told me the story, I really dug within myself to kind of think like, hey, do you really know this guy, right? Because if he assaulted your friend, right? And then the way that she described it, in one part that I can share, is that she said it was like a light switch. Like one minute he was a nice guy, gentleman, pulling out my chair, what have you, so at this formal dance thing, and the next minute he was like a monster, just like filled with
Mm.
rage, committing this atrocity against me. And I was like, wow. So like, right. So that that part really struck with me, that someone could just kind of flip on and flip off. And right,
Mm,
another part, and she said, is like, she said, because this thing happened in like some secluded area, and she was like, "That's weird, right? That it happened in this area." And I was like, "I don't guess so." And she was like, "Wait, you don't find it weird that it's happened in this secluded area, like in a bathroom and stuff like that, and no one had to use the bathroom, whatever?" And the more I thought of it, was like, "Oh yeah, that is kind of weird that like you were all secluded while at this formal thing and in a bet, right?" And because she was like, like I was saying, like all those things, like stop, no, don't, like right, that we teach
mhm,
women specifically, right? Because we kind of socialize, we teach women one thing and then another thing. And I was like, some more thought, I was like, yeah, that is kind of weird, right? And so that helped me realize that sexual assault is a planned thing, right? And so the
mhm,
more that sometimes I heard my friend's story, when I started to get into the work, I started doing more research, and I lined up like the research with my friend's story, and they just kind of matched, right? It was some
mm,
guy that the survivor knows. Sorry, it's not always a man, but usually the survivor knows the person committing the harm. Usually, it's a planned series of events. When it comes to college students, usually there's alcohol, and usually the bad person, the attacker, absolves himself of any wrongdoing by saying things
mm,
like, "You were wearing this, or you were drunk, or you were dancing with me, or you're what's right." And so, um, so that was like one critical moment in a series of critical moments that kind of pushed me to be like, how can I use my masculinity to teach more about this, right? Because the
mm,
stats, right? So not all men commit sexual assault by any means, right? So some of the stats say like between roughly 15% of men, 12 to 15% of men, let's say on a given college campus, commit assault, right? So the other 85, whatever, some odd percent of men don't commit sexual assault, right? So at that point, I was like, so how can I take it upon myself to reach those guys, right? To empower and
mm,
embolden them,
mhm,
right? So that we can become like a galvanizing force. So that's what, again, one of the critical moments on my friend's story my junior year in college that I heard.
mm.
I was like, all right, I can't
Yeah,
just like not do something now, right? I can't like I
yeah,
can't go about pretending like this doesn't happen here, like that one school told me. I can't
mhm,
pretend that like I don't know anyone because I did. I can't pretend like I don't have any power because I do. You know what I mean? So
yeah,
that was another thing that kind of moved me, if you will,
mm,
towards that, rather towards
mhm,
this work.
mhm. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, wow. Since you've been doing this work for so long, you said around maybe 2008 to today, so that's about 10, 12 years.
Hmm.
What are some things, or how have you seen the scope of prevention, advocacy, and education? How have you seen that scope grow over the last 12 years?
Yeah, and so I would say one of the things, which is both a good thing and as well as like I'm not sure about that, is that we now have people outside of the field talking about it in mainstream circles. It might not be polite dinner conversation at the moment, but folks are talking about it, right? So, for instance,
Mhm.
I was on my Facebook feed the other day, right? Whatever. And I came across a clip of Mike Tyson talking about toxic masculinity. Right. And
Mhm.
so to me, it's like the irony of ironies. This dude, like this huge guy, physically imposing guy, he still is opposing at like 50, physically opposing, intimidating. He like in his sport, he was the intimidating figure in his sport, right? Like he was the quote unquote toxic male in his sport, right? So, right, that's inside the ring. And outside the ring, he had a bunch of stuff that like also lend itself that he was the toxic masculine person that like I would point to and be like, you don't want to be like this person because like that says not that you will victimize, but like that kind of right says that you're gonna take advantage of someone, you're gonna objectify someone, right? So the fact that we have people like Mike Tyson talking about toxic masculinity, and look, Mike has grown since the days right when he was a champ,
Mhm.
and
Mhm.
he assaulted, I believe, Robin Gibbons and went to jail. Right, he's grown. Um, so that's one of the good things, right? Is that people are talking about it, right?
Mhm.
But I say the bad thing, bad way. Now, I say that kind of tongue in cheek, but not really, is because um, it almost feels as if like we collectively don't take it seriously until X entertainer endorses
Mm.
it, right? So that's kind of the sobering part. So
Mhm.
in
Mhm.
some ways, it feels like our work is to get people like Mike Tyson talking about it, so that people can really buy into it,
Mhm.
knowing that if right? Like if we had our like a platform where folks, could listen to like the research and the stories and this and then that,
Sure.
maybe that
Yeah.
might move some people's behaviors. But so that was kind of a
Hmm.
funny thing that I just noticed recently. But yeah, I mean, I think that now people are talking about like bystander intervention. I believe for the last president, President Obama, he wrote that into one of his briefings in terms of like how do you prevent sexual violence on the college campus. So now we're seeing less sexually objectifying Super Bowl ads and commercials, right? So all these like small changes, like right. So now our sons and daughters can watch the Super Bowl and like not be highly offended by all the questionable commercials, right? So those are kind of some of the things that we're noticing that while not perfect, at least it feels like we're kind of getting to a better place. I'll
Okay.
just kind of say that.
Yeah. 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 Great. And I think hearing the story you shared with your friend in college, and knowing a lot of the current college students that you probably journey with in some way, shape, or form, looking at it personally, what are
Hmm.
some of the challenges, or, I mean, I hate to say the word joys, but
Yeah.
that you feel personally when doing this work?
Some of the challenges and some of the
Like, how does it
joys.
affect you personally, I guess?
Yeah, tough. So now I've been quote unquote working in the field for about 12 years, but before that I was doing some volunteer work. So
Mhm.
it feels like I've been doing the work for about 15 to 20 years, right? And so I share that only for context. And so I will share, just last week I was watching a video because I'm looking to do some work about around Native American Heritage Month, specifically for survivors of sexual violence. Right. So if you don't know, right, survivors or Native survivors have like a 1 in 3 chance, like over 50% of survivors who are Native have some sort of either sexual intimate partner violence in their past, right, in terms of trauma, right, which is probably double the rate of like a non-Native folks, right. So I watching this documentary the other day, and it was just a sobering reality, and it left me cringing on the inside. And so one of the challenge, honestly, is even all these years later, like I still feel tense when I hear stories of trauma and how people can't get away and there are no resources. And so in Alaska, they were talking about what this document is based off of. Some of the reports or some of the I guess theories were that victimization happens because there are not a lot of resources. So if a
Mhm.
police has to come, law enforcement has to come, they have to take a helicopter to this one remote village, and there are no shelters and there's no kind of monetary resources. There's no safe houses for people to go, and it's rampant through communities. And when someone does report, rather when someone does acknowledge the victim, that is, they get shunned by family, by the community, and right, and should they were to report, they still have to either go to school or go to work or go to their place of worship with this person, right? And again, this runs, men, women, boys, and girls in terms of victimization, right? And so there were a lot of boys coming forward saying, this person in my community, in my family, assaulted me. I didn't know what to do, and so
Mm.
just kind of hearing those kinds of, I mean, people call them stories, but I say they're more like journeys.
Mm.
Just still affects me, probably in ways I don't even know, kind of taking all that stuff on. So those are right. So that's kind of the one of the glaring things that I would say that, yeah, it's like a still, like you still need to find time to decompress, to vent, to like space out, to kind of get all those toxins out. So that's something that I noticed. Joy is like, I mean, I'd say that I found a lot of mentors and colleagues in the movement that are like now friends. So right, so when we get together, it's not just talking about preventing sexual violence, but it's like, oh, how's your daughter doing, and what are you guys doing for the summer, and stuff like that. So just having those same connections with people that I can trust and kind of talk to and say, hey, did you read this one thing, and you know how I right are you right now, and right, like how asinine was it that this happened, and this person wasn't prosecuted. So I guess one of the challenges is that you do find connections with folks, student wise as well as colleagues that you can kind of really turn to. And I would say on a college or campus like such as Caldwell, it's been really warming just to kind of feel and see the number of people who, because when I came here 2 years ago, I had no idea how it was going to be received, right? Like um, I was ready for like that doesn't happen here kind of response, right? I had to got all I didn't know it's small Catholic university, I had no idea. But I would say people like you and people, other folks across campus just been so warm and so receptive, um, which helps me, right? Because my job really is to make sure people know that no matter your work, this doesn't does impact you, right? And so I really have to dig deep. So I say, all right, so people are on board and engaged, but how can I make sure they're really engaged, kind of keep them engaged, right? And so
Mhm.
it's just been so good and so not it's never easy, but that's been like one less hurdle that I don't feel like I have to push the level of engagement as much. So now we can dig deeper and talk
Mhm.
about let's make committees, right? So now we're talking about how can we talk about sexual violence in like Black and Latinx communities, right? How can we talk about sexual violence with the LGBTQ plus community, right? And so just having those connections here of again staff as well as students, employees largely, and students really helps the work helps me push the work more, right? If right as opposed to I had to jump over all those hurdles previously, the work would be done at a much slower pace, right? So the students
Mhm.
here are great. I've worked with a lot of students. I have an amazing group of peer educators now who I love. I'm recruiting for more peer educators now, which is great, right? And so when I bring students in, um, rarely is it resistance of like that doesn't happen here. It's always like yes, and how can I do more? How can I learn more? How
Mhm.
can I apply this to my community? You know what I mean? So I feel like students are really buying in, and they want to learn more and they want to do more, which is great. And so even things that I don't think about, right? They're like, we should be doing this. I'm like,
Mhm.
yes, we should. Let's spearhead that, right? Let's plan that out. Let's you want to get an Instagram account? Knock yourself out. Like take the content and deliver it where you think is going to serve us best. So
That's
that's some
great.
of the really good stuff to hear is people another good thing that people taking the content and then tailoring it or fitting it to reach even more students or putting their own spin on it. You know what I mean? To really reach their friends and reach their circle. So those have been some of the good things.
That's great. That's awesome. And I'm sure, truthfully, in part to the ways that you empower those students that you work with too, which is
Yeah,
great.
we try to. Yeah, yeah.
Um, so one of the things that you had mentioned was for the challenging moments, the difficult moments, being able to kind of take a step back to process what you're hearing, what you're seeing, feeling, all of that. I think that touches so much to spirituality. And I know you and I had a little conversation about
Hmm.
kind of faith and spirituality. So I want to eventually ask you about what that connection might be with the work that you do in faith spirituality for you. But first, I'm going to ask you what is kind of your spiritual journey been like for you? And more so, where do you find yourself at right now, where you stand?
Yeah, so that's a really interesting question. So I'm not sure quite where to begin, but I guess I'll begin here. So I was raised Baptist, right? And I'm not sure if we were Southern Baptist or what, but my family, I joke with my friends, my family's from Carolina, right? And that's how I describe my roots. We're from Carolina. I think we came maybe Kentucky or Tennessee, whatever, but the bulk of my family and folks are from Carolina, right? And so again, my grandmother raised me, so she brought that go to church every Sunday, worship the Lord and praise Jesus with her to her family in New Jersey, right? So that's how I grew up, right? Going to church every Sunday. I sang in the choir. I did all those things. I actually wanted to be a preacher at some point because I was like so like yes, this is my thing, and I loved MLK, and I was like I'm all about this life, right? That's kind of how I grew up. And so I never knew that there were different kind of denominations or kind of like sects or different parts of like a Christian faith. I just to me it was I was a Baptist and sorry, and then and I went to school. I went to Catholic school for high school, private Catholic school when I was in high school, right? So I knew at least about those two, but I didn't know like Presbyterian. I had no idea what other people did. But I knew that at the core of it, like it kind of was all similar, not the same, but similar, right? So like in Baptist, at least my church, like we were the ones like singing and dancing and praising and shouting and stuff like that, right? So like that really kind of not spiritual, but like uplifting sort of energy and sort of engagement, right? That we had. Where when I went to Catholic high school, that wasn't the case. It was a different kind of atmosphere and aura altogether, right? Um, um, And I didn't know at the time, but that like engaging part was or would go on to be important, right? So which comes to the second part of your question, right? So through several different series, right? My grandmother died when I was 16, which had a profound impact on me. And one of the ways it did was that it, I don't know if it forced or made, but end up distancing myself from religion, right? Because it was, and one of the things I learned was that religion was an entity or an institution, but obviously within that you have people, right? And they carry out religion, at least as I was experiencing at 16, right? And so when folks would say, people might, pastor would say, oh, do this or this, do this or that. I never saw God with my own eyes do that. I saw the reverend or the deacon do or not do those things, right? And so when I was 16, I was like, wait a minute, you all are telling me this, but you're doing that. And here I am as a 16-year-old boy, and I was again heavy in the church, but like no one cared for me or comforted me afterwards. And I'll never forget, I had the one conversation with someone that I considered my godfather at the time. He was saying that, oh, if your father were to come back in your life, right, which is probably another segment, he come back in your life, he has to give up his role. I'm sorry, your mother has to give up her role as head of household because at this time I'm living with my mom because your father's not back. And I'm like, wait, what? So like that. So it was mind-boggling to me that I found, and I didn't have the words then, but it had all this like gendered ideology in it,
Mm-hmm.
right? Of women being second class. Now remember, I grew up with a household full of women, so this idea that women were like worse or not as good as men, I was like, yeah, that that didn't jive in my mind, right? Because I knew that women were just as strong, smart, what have you, as men. So 16 is when I was like, okay, I'm not doing the church thing anymore. And then fast forward, I went to college. I began to I never took a class in like gender or anything like that, but I took sociology classes, right? So I was learning about race and religion and different genders and ideologies and things of that nature. And that made me push it back even more, and not because I was mad with religion, but I was mad with how the people around me were carrying out religion. So they were telling me things, and I'm like, you realize that makes no sense, right? So they would say things like, my grandma would be like, oh, or so and so, lived in the belly of a whale for. And I'm like, you, you mean you want me to think that this person lived inside the belly of a whale for like 40 days or whatever it was? Like that human realistically just cannot happen. Like I don't know. I just don't, I'm not really down with that, right? And so I get that maybe it wasn't exact to that extent, but maybe it was a symbol of something else larger in life, right? But that's not how it was
Mm-hmm.
taught to me. It was
Yeah.
taught that like these were the actual things that happened. I was like, okay, yeah, I'm not down with that. So I pushed it away probably more so, right, because
Mm-hmm.
of the people who would teach me about religion, just in ways that didn't, I guess, line up with I don't know what I don't say common sense. I don't want to offend it, but like it just didn't line up, right? So and I had dubbed myself of the family the heathen because my family was all religious, and it was that's kind of, and like if you had a hardship you just prayed, and I was like, but what about like doing something about said heart, like what about yes, pray, but like what about putting forth some effort or what have you? And it's like, nope, just pray. And I was like, okay, I'm done. I'm not. So right, so it was a struggle, right, where I was like, I'm not the religious person anymore.
Mm-hmm.
So that was like in my college days and so every Sunday when I would come home for like holidays, I said like, hey, I'm going to church, you want to come with me? And I would just roll over or whatever. And know some days I'd go and I just kind of sit there and kind of absorb it all, and I would still be shaking my head at people. um but then, right, I don't know what or how it happened, but I began to see that maybe the story of the whale wasn't like, maybe that's not how it truly happened, but like, what can you take from that, right? So my mind began to shift, right? And so the reason why my Baptist upbringing was important, or is important rather, was because at some point I began to link those songs, those hymns, with the Negro spirituals that my ancestors sang back during slavery. Like, all right, so this has a deep, for me now, it has a deep rooted meaning or connection, right? So now, and I don't know the last time I've been to church, but like when I hear songs or hymns or people singing, to me, it's not just about God. I mean, it is, but it's also for me a way to I guess mentally connect back to my ancestors
Mm-hmm.
and their hardships, right? So now I'm at a point where I try to take different parts of religion, of like the quote unquote religion, right? And I now find myself to be more of a spiritual person, trying to practice what those pastors were saying to me back all those kind of 20, 30, 40 years ago.
Hmm.
Trying to practice it more than I digest or kind of buy into like this notion of, again, gender roles and
Hmm.
strictly living by the Bible and that sort of stuff. So not sure if that answers
Excellent.
it, but it's kind of where I find myself at this
Yeah.
kind of weird place now. Like it makes sense to me, but it may not make sense to other folks. But it's kind
No,
of where I am.
yeah, no, I really appreciate you sharing that. And I think it makes perfect sense to me. So if that's helpful in any way. But no, I think that that's so great because I do hope that there are some students who are seeing this. And I almost guarantee you that there are people at Caldwell who have had that same experience and that same journey of, and it's all a journey.
Right.
I think you had mentioned that when you work with students, like it's not necessarily a story, it's a journey because there's no endpoint, there's
Hmm.
no right way of going along the path or, whatever you want to call it. But I think that that's really important the way that you, yeah, just kind of like almost like your analytical mind just wasn't quite fitting into the constructs there of religion
Hmm.
or the ones that you had been taught or told. And so as you've moved along in your journey, hopefully you've encountered other people who live and experience religion in different ways. But I think all of that, we take all of those things that we experience and encounter and we bring them into kind of who we are. And I also love the kind of the familial ancestry connection that you mentioned with like
Hmm.
hymns, and it almost speaks to like the suffering Christ, the suffering
Sure, sure,
side of our
sure.
faith, and like moving forward in that. And I don't want to jump to conclusions, but so I'll just ask the question of how do you see kind of where you are spiritually right now? How do you see that connected to the work that you do in any way?
Yeah. So I think about when I was in college learning about different religion. I don't know what class it was, but it may have been high school. But I learned about the quote unquote Protestant ethic, or I think that's what the phrase was, right? This idea that you like whatever you wanted, you had to sacrifice in order to get there, right? You weren't just going to get that thing just by sheer luck or happenstance or some good fortune, right? Like if you really wanted to, like if you wanted to become the mayor or teacher or politician, wherever your teacher will have you, right? You have to put forth the work and really kind of sacrifice, right? So, um, in college, when I was again not religious, probably what didn't consider myself spiritual. When like my friends are going out to parties and stuff, I was like, nope, I gotta, like I have work to do. I have to like either physically work to like make money, or I have to do my programs because I was an RA, or I had to like read some sociology text or write a paper, whatever, right? So like right, so now my entire life feels like one big sacrifice. Like when everything that I like, whenever any endeavor I have, I say to myself, right, like I want that thing, but I have to sacrifice in order to get that thing. I have to do the work necessary to get that thing, right? And so in my day-to-day life, I might want to go and spend time on social media, but I got to go to the grocery store first. I have to clean my bathroom first, right? So I try to find kind of small pragmatic ways to carry out this thing that I still hold with me, even though I may not follow that specific religion. Um, so right, that's kind of one way I think talking about like on a day-to-day basis. And I mean, within the work, I would say that I try to look for different points of reflection. I had this thing a few years ago where I said to one of my supervisors, like, I like to reflect on Fridays. And I know that in the kind of in organized religion, prayer, at least in my religion growing up, was really important, right? Like that's how you speak to God, right? You pray to God. And I don't know that I pray a whole lot now, but I do try to find time to focus in on reflection, right? And for me, that helps to spark new ideas of programming, and that helps me to assess. All right, I had this conversation with this one student. It went really well. What can I take away? Or maybe it didn't go as well as I thought about it. What can I take away? So this idea of assessment and wanting to be a better person, right? And so we
Mm,
talk about religion. We had talked about like you know, as people we sin all the time, right? And so while I don't use that language now, I still in I guess the spirit of that of like we can be striving to be better people, or we should be striving to be better people, or you know,
mm,
like the ills or sins that I did yesterday, I should be learning from those and not doing those things tomorrow, right? And so in my
mm,
work, I always try to say, all right, well, this thing is happening now today, but what can I do differently, or how can we collectively be better than we were yesterday? So
mhm,
I'm always looking to like push things forward and kind of push and get more students and get more people to come to programming. Or maybe it's not about programming. Maybe it's just kind of sitting with that student in the moment of need, but just be better at that, right? And so
mhm.
being even more okay with that silence. Being okay with the fact that like we can't figuratively kind of run amok and kind of burn things down because the system isn't working. Like how can we fix and improve that system, right? To make it better for the next survivor who right who come who may experience harm.
Mhm.
So that idea of like pushing forward, reflecting on things, but then kind of going back to that Protestant ethic of like sacrifice, like you want to change that policy, but now you got to read gobs and gobs and gobs of pages of policies from
Mm.
different institutions, right, in order to kind of really kind of beef up your own proposal, right? So those, I guess, some of the things that I do. I would say in terms of
Yeah.
how it carry out, thinking about kind of reflecting the prayer idea, the sacrifice idea, the putting forth the work idea. So I think those are some of the ways that I try to fulfill it on a daily basis. And I think the thing for me is that I would never say that I not never, but like I wouldn't say that I'm a quote unquote religious person, but I think that many of the religious teachings I not adopt, but like I try to carry out because now I see how it connects, like how it connects to not just religion, but like the social life and the emotional component and even the physical component, right? So when I go, right, so I try to go to the gym every day, right, 4 days a week, and that is my way of getting those toxins out, right? One way of like getting those toxins out, right? So that might be my way of meditating for 40 minutes, like getting those toxins out, so that I can be a better vessel to hear people's journeys and kind of hear people are going through and be better equipped to respond appropriately for someone. So I try to take care of myself so that I can take care of other folks within the work. So that's a kind of another way that I try to carry out some stuff as well.
That's great. Wow, that's awesome. That's way more of a connection than than I was like initially like. I was like, oh, this will be a quick question, but that's so great the way that you connected it, and it's almost like all of these little hidden ways that this upbringing and almost this foundation that you received that hasn't always been um, or that you haven't always seen as like a
Hmm.
positive thing or a grace in your life, but sometimes that's what it is for us. It's a foundation in which we build on these other things that propel us forward.
Hmm.
So I thought that was great. The last thing I want to just talk to you about, I know that we've been working together a lot on some racial justice programming, but
Hmm.
specifically want to ask you about your I guess, propensity towards racial justice work. What is it
Hmm.
that you would say like propels you with a desire to do that work?
Where do I start? There's so many things here. All right. So my freshman year undergrad, we were reading about some my intro to social class, right? So remember this class, Dr. Parrott, who I had. We're reading about some stuff, and I had to write a paper about the sociology. No, sorry, the culture of poverty is what it was, right? I'm writing a paper on it, and I'm reading about how some sociology theorists or kind of researchers, right, were explaining via the text, right, how people from low income societies, right, and so for me that's like a polite way of saying people are poor, right, um, and maybe people don't say it now, but at least in that text, there felt like a racialized thing to it, right? So people from they call it like disadvantaged or inner cities, right, whatever, and they were like people from inner cities. One thing they do is they would try to not buy like store brand materials. Like you don't buy like the Shoprite version of Cheerios. Like you buy regular, or actually it wouldn't Cheerios. It would be like Frosted Flakes, whatever. Like you don't buy Shoprite Frosted Flakes. You buy regular Frosted Flakes to show that you weren't as poor as the next person,
Mm.
right? So I'm reading this stuff, right? And I'm thinking to myself, I could have told you that. Like, you didn't need to go to some grad school to figure that. Like, of course, that's what we did, right? So, right. So it was so it felt in those classes that like people were explaining things to me that, um, like now we say like my lived experience teaches me, right? But that wasn't the language back then. It was like listen to this researcher because they've done work in inner cities, and I'm like, I lived in the inner, like you're not gonna come tell me like how the culture of poverty, I'm gonna be telling you how the culture of poverty works, right? So so that was one turning point, right? And another turning point was where there were several, but like another turning point was probably sophomore junior in college. All goes back to college for some reason, right? I'm reading this textbook about different racial groups and their migration from their countries of origin to the United States, right? So of course we learn about sorry, we didn't learn about native, sorry, Native American or indigenous folks because they were here, right? And when it came to the story about black folk, the story just was, well, they didn't migrate here willingly, right? They were kind of forced, right, on boats and whatever, right? But I'm reading about stories of people who are Irish or Italian, right? And a lot of my friends in high school, like they wore their Italianness on their sleeves, like they're proud to be Italian and Irish, which is great. So I'm learning about how their ancestors came here, and I was in how they were not received warmly upon coming here, right? Coming to the United States, right? I'll never forget, but this class I learned about a sign about I believe it was the 60s, maybe the 50s, where Irish people who wanted to find work, there were signs on the storefront that said Irish need not apply, right? And I'm thinking to myself, that sounds awful, like an awfully familiar to the sign that says coloreds only, right? So now you got me thinking to myself, so there are a lot more similarities that we have in terms of like how we were maybe initially received than there are differences, right? In terms of like these structural differences, right? So that was another turning point, right? And then I mean, you kind of learn things like race isn't a biological trait, but a social construct, right? The fact that the first male's from Africa, so what does that? Rather, first person, so what does that mean? So like a few different kind of I would say experiences such as those, where I felt that it wasn't. We weren't. I mean, I hate to be kind of cliche, but like we're more the same than we are different, right? So all that sort of stuff. And then it got to a point where I just didn't want people telling me about my own background. I guess that's probably the core of it, right? In terms of like what Black folk was going through, what Black folk think and feel. And not that I didn't find value in that, right? In kind of some of those researchers and theorists. But I knew that like a lot of the struggle, like a lot of understanding the struggle came from having individual conversations with folks, right? So there's this movie called 13th. It's about the criminal justice system and the war on drugs, all this other stuff, right? And so the film does a really good job of kind of give like a history of things, right? Inner city, Black and Latino people, how drugs affects things, how crime affects things, how crime carry out affects things, right? But that film couldn't tell you how yes, fathers weren't there, but that
Mm.
means that women are catapulted, right, in terms of power, in terms of position of powers, right? And so now you have women teaching you as a boy how to be a person, but also how to be a man, right?
Mm.
And so now you have this idea, right? So that's kind of one thing, right? But also this idea that you know many boys reject that notion that your mom can't teach me how to be a boy, so now I'm gonna go hang out with we call the people guys putting in work or the guys selling drugs or the guys doing the pimping, right? So I'm going to gravitate towards these toxic guys, right, in terms of crime, and they're going to teach me how to be a man. So now you have this really kind of divided family structure where
Mm.
mom is trying to teach you, hey, go to school, get a good job, what have you. But the pimps in the house are saying, nope, you don't have to go to school. You can just go and find some women and they can carry the drugs for you or what have you, right? And so, again, while the film was good to teach like big picture stuff, it couldn't really teach you those intimate details that if you don't know those, you're just like, why don't they just leave? Why don't use drugs? Why don't they just stop selling drugs? It kind of wasn't that simple to say I'm not gonna sell drugs, right? I mean, you could, right? But the film doesn't tell you if you don't, you're gonna get beat up after school like every day of your life. So it's like, all
Mm.
right, so I probably should join a gang then, because like, I don't want to get beat
Mhm.
up anymore. You know what I mean? So even if you don't want to be in a gang, you gotta rep those colors, do those things because you want to get beat up,
Yeah.
right? So right, and then once you're in it, you got to carry it out. You can't like not do anything, right? So or like your friend might say, "Hey, Ab, I need you to hold this thing for me, hold this package for me." They don't ever say it's drugs and drugs are bad and you can go to jail. They don't like hold this thing for me. It won't be a big deal. You make $500. You do that once or twice. You got some Jordans. You got a PlayStation. You got whatever. All right, so now we can just do this thing like a few more times. And I can get my own apartment. I can get a car, whatever. And right, so now it doesn't seem as bad. And the fact that at least in our community, some of the government officials, elected officials, were maybe turning the other cheek as you were doing the thing, and they knew that you knew that they know that you know. You know what I mean? And so if
Mhm.
you are a young boy and the police are looking the other way, literally as you're carrying stuff or selling stuff, you're like, well, it must not be that wrong. Like, yeah,
Mhm.
people say don't do drugs, but like no one's really enforcing that. So like, what's the big
Mhm.
deal?
Mm.
So again, I just at a point where like, do you really know this stuff? So and again, I think we need the theories and the research and stuff like that. But I guess I just got to a point where I was like, all right, I can probably lend kind of my voice to some of the things right that the research are speaking to give it more of a personal connection. And so I always try to lift and champion the stories of women specifically, probably because that's my upbringing, right? Kind of first and foremost. Um, but also because I think that those stories are not told enough.
Mm.
Uh, and it's like if you want to know how to work real change, follow the line of women, and they'll kind of show you kind of show you the rules of the game.
Mm.
So right, so that's kind of how I got into it, and then um, yeah, I think that's kinda my journey, my I guess my introduction into it. But I think also, I think this can't be overstated, was that since the age of 13, um, kinda just in my life, I've always been the black kid, and by that I mean I went to a predominantly white high school. It was my own choosing, but I went to predominantly white high school, predominantly white college, university, right? And I've always been the black kid. It's like, how do you describe a person where everyone else but them looks the same, right? You don't
Mm.
say, "Oh, Cindy with the curly hair," or "Cindy with the blue eyes," or "Cindy on the field hockey team." It's like, nope, Abdul, who? The black kid. Oh, right. And so that baggage, right? Of like, I gotta now carry this weight of like what blackness means to folk. And so
Mm.
like that was another thing that I kind of just got fed up with being the black guy.
Mm.
And I think also just wanted to like I found allies. I kind of wanted to like kind of I guess cement those bridges of like my friends who didn't view me as like the black guy and that I was a full person. Like, so how can I take you and kind of kind of make you down with the cause as well, if that makes any sense.
Mhm.
So that's kind of another factor in it as well. So it's a bunch of different, I guess, stories, but I think at the end of it, um, so I think that I kind of live in this world like two different realities, right? So I grew up in
Mm.
an age where um not my parents, but my mother's mother, they lived in the age of like the height of the civil rights movement, right? And that was passed down to me, not through stories, but just kind of how like the community was. So I grew up in an age of Christian religion. You got to follow Martin Luther King, and you have to turn the other cheek, and you have to pray to God, and you have to do protests and stuff like that, right? But in my community, again, which movies won't tell you, there was a huge number of growing numbers of people who are Muslim, identify as Muslim, right, or Islam, and so that sort of like militant um, idea of not so much carry guns like try to commit harm, but like we're not going to let you come and terrorize us, right? And right, and so this idea of like a kind of giving back to the community of like free breakfast, free breakfast for the kids, as started by the Black Panther movement, right? So the idea of like militant doing something about your problems or your injustice, right? So within me, I find myself, and still to this day, sometimes saying to myself, all right, should I be like the militant, like go get him Abdul kind of side, or do I
Mm.
need to be reserved and kind of just wait and kind of see how things kind of play out kind of side? And so I think it depends on the day that you catch me. It depends on how much sleep I had and kind of which side you're gonna get, right? But again, like they don't tell you that in some ways, right? Not in all, but in some ways, there's always been a split, right? Of like, do you follow MLK or do you
Mm.
follow Malcolm X? right? And not that it's all that superficial, but you even go back to like Marcus Garvey or Booker T. Washington or W.D. Bozeman. Like so, like there's this idea of like who do you follow, right? And I've always been caught in the middle of like following both and
Mhm.
appreciating both. Do you know what I mean?
Mm.
Where some people are like, I
Mhm.
can't follow okay because turning the
Mhm.
cheek. I'm like, no, that got us far. That got
Yeah.
us a mile. I can't forget that, right? So let me be
Yeah.
long-winded here, but I kind of find myself in that split of like, depending on what day you catch me, is depending on which Abdul you're gonna get.
Mhm. Mhm.
So
I think that's so great because, like, one of the things that I feel like I hear you say is, first of all, the parallel between what you just said about working for racial justice and also what you shared with us about religion, right? Like, people want choose this or choose that. And,
yeah.
maybe sometimes we don't feel like we fit into this or that.
Oh,
And so, what
absolutely.
is that way forward? So, seeing some parallels there, but then I think I also like, as you were just sharing, the way that all these different paths that we just talked about, like the work that you do and where that came to be, your spirituality, all of that, like these almost like the divergence of like all of these paths, right? Because here you are in the midst of the conversation of racial justice talking about strong women who, I know at the beginning you mentioned like your aunts and
Mhm.
your mom and just like strong women who raised you. And here that's a part of your conversation, but then also was a part of why you do the work that you do. And so I think
Yeah,
it was really cool to um, just kind of see the divergence of all of those things
yeah.
that come together.
I think it's a really good point. So so one film that I will kind of secretly say that my favorite is The Color Purple, right? So within this
And
movie,
film study, you want
yeah,
to, you
absolutely.
majored in film study.
So one of the things that had a really big impact on my upbringing, but also a lot of other Black folk that I know is the color purple, right? And in
Mhm.
this movie, this film rather, the story of Suge, who's like the singer, she's a temptress, like she's all these things that like you're not supposed to want to be like. You know what I mean?
Mhm.
But one of the things, and I think this relates perfectly to what you said, is that she's probably in that film the most raw and authentic, but she also carries in her this identity of like God and like understanding that God is a higher being than herself, right? And I
Mhm.
think this holds true more so in the novel than it does in the film, right? So
Mhm.
even in the idea of sin or sinning, right, folks can still have an understanding of God and can teach you stuff about God that folks who are, let's say, quote unquote religious, at least in my upbringing, could have taught me, right? So
Mhm.
yes, absolutely, right. And I began to see kind of pick apart different spiritual um either like connotations or lessons learned,
Mhm.
just from folks from their walks of life, and not so much about how much church they attended, right? Because at
Mhm.
the end of the day, kind of Chris Rock said this in the joke, and I don't mean to belittle it, but he said, at
No,
the
no.
end of the day, um, if I am of a certain faith and I, didn't eat pork and I didn't do this and I didn't do that, but I killed a bunch of kids, am I going to go to heaven? Like, no, you're not going to go to heaven if you killed a bunch of kids and didn't eat pork, right? You got to live the life, right? And so I
Right.
find myself trying to live the life, right? Of
Mhm.
like trying to do good. And I say I'm sorry to my kids probably every day because I probably yell more than I want to admit. And I try to admit to my wife, hey, I'm working on this thing right now, and I try to give back and where I can financially in other ways. So I try to live the life and really
Mhm.
try to grasp different parts of religion from folks, whether they're sinning like Suge was in the movie, or whether they are the stand-up person like Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was. So
Mhm.
it's kind of where I find myself at this point.
That's great. That's great. Wow. That's awesome. Well, I think we'll end there unless you have anything else you would like to add.
No, I mean, I think that religion has been a great thing in terms of the foundation that it has led, right? But as you mentioned, I don't think that, well, yeah, I think that religion has a great, great construct in terms of like what it can give to you. But it's not, but in some respects, it's about like what are you going to take from it and do with it, as
Mhm.
opposed to like here's religion and it's going to give you a path to heaven. Well, not if you don't do the stuff. It's not
Mhm.
right. So, but thank you for hosting. I
Yeah.
really appreciate the conversation.
Great. Great. Awesome. You're welcome. You're welcome. Well, I would just like to thank all of our viewers for this week. Thanks for tuning in, for joining us. And thanks to Abdul for sharing with such vulnerability and openness, because I think that takes a lot, especially as a staff member. We're not always used to being that way with students. So appreciate that. And just want to say to everyone, hopefully you'll tune in next week. We'll be back with a new guest. So thank you for joining us and have a great rest of your day.